at the gym, and they just kind of go around socializing. But there may actually be other than the social aspect, there may be a beneficial effect of just being in the gym.
Oh, sure. Well, and
it's
there's
almost like a placebo effect.
Yes, well, and there's also a exercise explanation for this, the distraction hypothesis, which suggests that it's not the physical work that you're doing, but it's the fact that you're in a social environment that you enjoy, and you're away from environments that actually, exacerbate stress, work and so on. I mean, so taking that physical break. Yeah, I talk to this with my students, how you'll see one person on a treadmill in the gym, and there's they're running, their face is red, and they look in the mirror, and they see somebody walking around with a 2.5-pound barbell, and they're talking, and they're saying, that person is wasting their time, they're getting it, and the person on the phone saying, I'm having a really good time, and you should see this guy on the treadmill, he looks awful. It's like, so you could explain this by a placebo effect of socialization, but there are actually hypotheses that suggest it's the environmental factors that contribute to this. That was my thesis a long time ago. So, but yeah, that's a good point.
The studies that we've done utilizing the placebo is usually stretching, and they always show an improvement, the stretching groups, where they're actually not doing, the stretching is very light,
yes.
So I don't think that there's a real physiological effect of stretching, compared to the other groups that they've seen.
Yeah, so, but some people would say, well, stretching is actually exercise, it's just not cardiovascular exercise. So yeah, I think stretching is a viable option, but people will argue one way or another against it. There's a very recent study that in Lancet that involved assessments of over 1 million people, and they looked at the exercise benefits of different forms of exercise at different dosages. And what they found was that the social forms of exercise, team sports or group activities, had slightly larger benefits. So that kind of bespeaks to the social characteristics of exercise actually contributing to that. But all the other forms did too. And for me, that's when, the pill works in all its various guises. So it's an interesting study. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your talk.
Oh.
I can't stop thinking about this. What would your advice be to a precocious graduate student who might be doing human-centered research here regarding the placebo effect and expectations? Because in terms of reproducibility, you don't want to over-exaggerate the effect of exercise and put expectations into the participant's head, and yet it's 50% of the benefit, according to the article. So what would you recommend?
So one way to do this would be to assess their expectations going in, and you can look at the variability. So there'll be people who have very strong positive expectations versus some who have neutral or even negative. So if you know what their expectation of benefit is going in, you could use that almost like as a controlling variable, or group the individuals in terms of having high or low expectations. So there are these studies where instead of providing them information or manipulating their expectations by telling them what it's going to do, you simply assess where they are in terms of their belief or outcome. So that would be a very standard way of doing this. And what you could do in that case is throw out people who have very high or what you think are excessively positive expectations, or you could look at them separately and then compare them to people going in who have neutral or low expectations. So that would be my suggestion. The other thing would be to try to provide them with a positive script, but not too positive. But when you do that, what you need to do is assess them afterwards to see whether they bought into it or not. Because you could be selling it and they say, oh, exercise has never worked for me, I don't believe what you're saying. But that would be interesting as well.
It's tough because it's always a selection issue, right? People who enroll in who are coming to your study who are interested in exercise,
yes,
are coming to you because they're
that's right. Yeah. So you're going to get a natural bias. Or people are not going to, oh, a study on exercise and mental health, or exercise and it's going to do, sure, yeah. So you may be missing out on sort of the neutral or negatives that would, provide you a little bit greater information. So that's a good point. Yeah. Very, very hard to get around that one. Yes, Jane.
Jane, it sounds like that. Let's take exercise intervention as an example. That you're now grabbing the entire psychosocial context of the intervention as a placebo. Like everything that is a potential bias is now being subsumed under this umbrella.
It could. Well, that's one of the standard interpretations. Yes. How much I buy into that? Well, I think almost more in the case of sport than exercise. And the reason I say that is that athletes have these they have these very high expectations, and this sort of the social, the cultural nature of ergogenic aids, I think, even drives that further. In a medical context, maybe it's a little more complicated, because hospitals are dangerous places, so you might not want to be there, and I might not like to be there. But in the case of sport, these are things that the person is actively pursuing, so there's this approach mentality, which is kind of different than what you see in medical situations.
So as a kind of follow-on to that, then do you reject the premise that if a treatment is not superior to a placebo, then it's ineffective?
Okay, well, we actually published an editorial on that in the case of ergogenic aids, because there are ergogenic aids that we know are placebos. There's no medical basis for them. And in some cases, people say, well, we know that they work through the placebo effect, and the placebo effect is real, so there's our mechanism. I think that's unethical, but it's sort of twisty, and I don't have a good answer in your case. I would be very cautious about that.
So, I was fascinated by this idea that maybe a placebo is interacting with the treatment in a negative way, that the efficacy of the treatment might, at least on the outcomes that you're measuring, might be less because it somehow interacted with the placebo effect in a way that wasn't positive.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of an actual example that would fit with that. The example I was trying to show is that if you have 50 here and 50 here with each, that might only add up to 90 because there's sort of an overlap.
Mm-hmm.
But so I wouldn't say that that's necessarily making the treatment worse. It's just that placebo doesn't contribute as much more. What you're suggesting is there may actually be a negative effect. I can't answer that. I will say one interesting study, if I can remember the details of it, is that when they provided, if you give negative information on the outcome, in other words, there may be negative side effects, you may even have a greater benefit because there's this expectation of those things occurring. So there's that part of it too. In other words, there are negative side effects to drugs that work, that improve your condition, and those negative side effects could be a nocebo in some case, but if you're expecting them and it's the price you have to pay, then, especially in the case of sport. Yeah, I'm not giving you a good answer because I don't know.
That's fine.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you.
I'm sure we're all dying for coffee, right?